guess I'm astonished that after all this time, we don't know basically everything about it.
No,
Can
we
you
don't.
explain that?
Well, they're still covering up things. I mean, they're still. I mean, the fact that even these documents released in October were only a partial release, and I complained because it was quite obvious it was a partial release, and they said we're not going to review this for another 10 years. It's still secret. The fact that the conventional story, even though my book presents a slightly different chronology, is still being sustained. One of my authors is here today, and she's had similar problems, I think, getting information through freedom of information requests. And ironically, the Russians have been the most helpful, but maybe they would be. But the British have really been very unhelpful. So trying to get, for example, information, surveillance techniques in the 1950s are still top secret. When I've asked to have a file opened, which you're allowed to do if someone is dead, I'm required to produce a death certificate for someone born in 1897 who's had a Times obituary. Anything to frustrate the researcher is a scandal. But it goes on, and I think it's there's still a lot more of the story to come out.
I heard, I think someone told me that a long time ago, that 650 spies were murdered because of this Cambridge trial.
Well, I think the problem is we just don't know. Certainly there was an operation in Albania that Philby betrayed, and about 35 agents were picked up there. But we just don't know because we don't know if operations failed, if it was due to any of those particular individuals. We don't know what was given when. I mean, one of the ironies of the whole thing is the Russians, the material was so good, the Russians didn't believe that they weren't provocateurs and double agents and actually ignored a lot of the stuff they gave them. So when these documents were released in the 1980s, most of them were untranslated. I think it's really difficult to do an audit, but he would have known, certainly Burgess would have known the order of battle, he would have known a lot of the agents, so he certainly has blood in his hands, but how much we don't know.
I think that there is probably a simpler answer to your question of why. So I would say that as a random sampling, if you'd had a Cambridge ring, you had one at the other place as well, and you'd have had several elsewhere, and all these guys would also have recruited, or informed recruiters rather, who would have been sent out and to get second-generation spies, etc., would have imparted themselves into, the various universities. And so I think they were all doing it at that point, and exceptional.
Burgess, talks about the pistol shot in the dark, and I think it was that moment at the beginning of the 30s, the sense that the future lay with Russia. The only way to stand up to the dictators was to become a communist. I mean, you've got to remember that of those 800 communists in Cambridge at that time, only a dozen or so probably became spies. Became spies, because I think a lot of them dropped out, like Romy Rees. A lot of them saw the light with the Nazi-Soviet Pact, or Budapest, or the Purges, or the Second World War, whatever it was. A lot of them, grew up basically. So I think there are lots of people. A lot of them, of course, remained overt communists. People like Eric Hobsbawm and others still believed in communism, but just didn't want to be spies. So that's why I think we have to look at the personal element as being the factor that drew them. I mean, Philby, when he was recruited, said, "You do not turn down an offer of an elite force," and this gave them a sense of power. And they all operated, they all led deceitful lives. I mean, their personal lives. Philby was a great philanderer. Burgess was always, highly promiscuous. And so the two, I think, do go together. And you're right though that they recruited people. We don't know who they are. We have these code names from the Petrogin archive and from the Venona decrypts. We know the Russians made lists of their recruits and numbered them, and their gaps, for example, even between Philby, Burgess, and Maclean. So there are other people there. And certainly when I talked to Michael Sergei Kondrashev, who was a KGB general who ran Burgess in Moscow, he said there's a lot more. Well, basically, I said, why did you let them go? Because, of course, Burgess going opened, basically revealed Philby. He said, we didn't care, we had plenty of others. Yep.
Were there any spies from your research who you know from the code names, really significant people, and you suspect certain other public figures or people of importance may have been them, but you just didn't have enough evidence to actually say it?
There are a couple. I mean, one, Rothschild fits. There's a husband and wife team that we think is Rothschild. I can't remember his name. I mean, a lot of them have names which are, they weren't very clever about code names. So Blunt's code name was Tony. So there's Professor, and there's the one called Chauffeur, and there's one called Poet. you could possibly try and work out. And there are husband and wife, the father and son teams. So absolutely, I mean, and some people have speculated on the names, but until we really have either stuff from the Russian archives or the British archives, we don't really know. But yeah, certainly some people like Rothschild have certainly been identified.
Yes, you located Burgess's sort of resentment against the establishment from the fact that he was rejected from poverty. He didn't get into it. It's funny because, incidentally, Franklin Roosevelt was not kept for the Porcellian Club, the elite club at Harvard. And some people say that he said it was the greatest disappointment of his life. He said one of the reasons why he took extra keen delight in going after the malefactors of great wealth was because they were the very people who rejected him. But when you said about the apostles that they themselves consider themselves in elite society superior to humanity, it's extraordinary that they then themselves would have thought they were acting in the interest of the proletariat in becoming Soviet spies, people for whom they had nothing but contempt. And didn't N15 know on Friday that about the identity of Burgess and McLean?
Yes,
And they left on Monday.
Yep.
And George Steiner, in an essay, said that the British, the N15, they didn't work on the Sabbath. Wait, but do you not think they would have got them if it would not have been such an embarrassment to the British establishment?
Well, I think MI5 did let them escape, and if you think about it, I mean, the files were released in October. That Phil Buckley was fingered in 1951. He was dismissed, but not actually. He was allowed to leave in 1963. John Cairncross was fingered in 1951. He was allowed to go and live in Rome and America. Leo Long was another one. There are a whole series of people, and actually Blunt. If you look at these things, Blunt was actually fingered in 1951, and nothing happened until 1963 when Michael Straight came forward, and he was then given immunity. Right. And it was only when the book came out in 1979 that they were forced to go public with Blunt.
And he was the keeper of the Queen's pictures. It would have been an extraordinary embarrassment.
But I mean, he wasn't the keeper of the Queen's pictures in 1951.
Right,
but absolutely, and I think that's one of the reasons. I mean, one of the ironies is that the British were the least keen on Burgess going back because he knew where all the bodies were buried, and he kept threatening to say, that he might, say something. So I think there has been, it just suits people's purposes. But what's weird is they then spent, having let them get away, they then seem to interview everyone who had any contact with them to try and find out more. So why they didn't do this earlier and why they then, having found out stuff, they didn't actually pursue it is weird.
Just to come back to that last point, you said about Blunt that there was a cover-up that lasted for many years. Now I've heard that he was blackmailing people to keep himself secret because he had information about the Duke of Windsor.
That's right. Well, there's a suggestion that he'd been sent off in a secret mission at the end of the Second World War to pick up documents in Germany which related to the Duke of Windsor's support for Hitler and embarrassing letters from Queen Victoria's daughter. I think the Queen Victoria's daughter's thing is true, but I think there's no evidence to suggest that he did anything on the Duke of Windsor. I've actually seen some of the correspondence between Blunt and Burgess, and I think that's just not a true story. But you're right, if that had been true, it would certainly have given him a slight hold. But is that a bigger hold than, because we all kind of knew the Duke of Windsor was sympathetic to Hitler, is that a bigger story than covering up a spy? I don't know.
Were any women recruited in their own right, other than being somebody's wife, like a husband or wife?
Yeah. One of the members of the Oxford Ring was a woman called Jennifer Hart, who became quite a senior Home Office official, and who was married to an academic at Oxford, and that's about the only one. There were very few women at Oxbridge at that time, so there weren't many to recruit. I think probably a bit more sensible than the men. There were quite a lot of Russian female agents. People like Sonia and actually Lizzie Friedman, and a woman who ran them called Edith Tudor Hart. So quite a lot of the Russian agents were female, actually. They were a more equal opportunity employer, I think.
And so when this person told me that 650 spies were killed throughout the world, all over the world, because of the Cambridge Five, that I think is the reason MI5 let them leave, because if they tried them, then Guy Burgess could talk about all the spies were killed, and that would make headlines all over it.
Well, I suppose he could have talked as well. One of the things that perplexed the British is that when he went to Russia, the Russians didn't make more of it. They didn't say, we've got these British diplomats and we're going to start spilling the beans. They didn't do it. They kept quiet about it for 5 years. And so it's a bit weird they didn't make more use of them. I think the problem is I've seen some of the work that was done by the Americans afterwards, damage limitation assessments, and they said that basically everything across the desk was betrayed, so everything from about 35 to 51. But it's very difficult to work out. I mean, your figure is interesting because I think it's very difficult to work out when an operation is blown or someone's killed or whatever. It's very difficult. There's so many variables that it's very difficult to work out what was the contributing factor. But you know, if you have a high authority from a member of a fellow Harvard member, then who am I?
Someone very good.
Someone very well. Then fine. Then you've learned something. I've learned something new tonight.
Was there a sense that the Soviets were disappointed by the fact that the spies had been caught and were packed off, exfiltrated back to Soviet Russia?
No, because I think the extraordinary thing is, I mean, the claim was that they didn't need to worry, they had so many. And if you think about it, Burgess hadn't actually been caught. I mean, he was the last person they should have sent. There must have been someone else they could have sent to escort McLean back, because of course, by using Burgess, that had immediately put suspicion onto Burgess and through Burgess onto Philby. So 3 of their most important agents were blown in one go. And I can't believe that they were that stupid. So I think they just didn't care. Burgess and McLean were burnt out cases, but Philby was crucial. He was right there at the heart of British and American liaison. To sacrifice him, they must have had something pretty impressive elsewhere.
Has anybody written a book about the cleanup operations afterwards? How the US cleaned up the situation, how the British cleaned it up, etc.?
Well, there have been, I mean, the files that came out in October go to some, are basically about what the reaction, and there were all sorts of positive vetting, a much more sense of positive vetting was introduced, there were various committees set up, and therefore the fact that you went to Eton Cambridge would not be a reason not to suspect you as a spy in the future. So, yeah, of course they looked at it afterwards. But it's until we have much more inside information from the intelligence agencies themselves, we don't know what happened. But I think the 2 big ramifications of this was it clearly damaged Anglo-American cooperation, particularly on atomic matters, and it damaged faith in the institutions of government. And the fact that there was this cover-up, I mean, the phrase "the establishment" was coined by the Spectator when the White Paper came out in 1955. But also, the fact that they're still covering up and they're still trying to prevent people from trying to get at the truth. I mean, I'm allowed now to make 1 request every 60 days on freedom of information. So I created a whole series of email accounts with names like Robert Burgess, and they then said that was vexatious. So what I must do is just give you, all of you, I can task you all to send in the freedom of information request. See if that will do the trick. Yeah.
What was the reaction in the States that the newly created CIA in England, did they actually come out with a report on the situation because they were both in Washington at the same time?
Well, absolutely, Americans. I mean, a lot of the stuff we get is from the American archives. The Americans were very concerned because, of course, all 3 of them had served in the Washington embassy and had access to American secrets. I mean, what I've seen is the suggestion that though McLean had access to atomic secrets, they were not technical secrets, they were political secrets, and actually those things weren't very important, they dated quite quickly. But they certainly knew about, Philby certainly would know about operations because he was the point man of the CIA. Burgess, I think, would have picked up things because he was friendly with Philby, he was friendly with Philby's secretary and all that. So absolutely, and they were all doing it. I mean, the problem was the CIA didn't want to share information with the FBI, we didn't want to share information with the State Department, we didn't want to share it with the chiefs of defence staff. So they were all, in a sense, operating separately. The great thing is we do see these separate reports, but none of them were talking to each other. And they were all trying to they didn't want to wash their dirty linen in public too. So the whole thing was slightly kept quiet. Yeah.
If I may, a lot of them justify their actions by saying that it helps balance power between East and West. Do you think that's true? And also, we don't really hear anything about our efforts to penetrate Russia, if that exists.
We didn't. I mean, this is what the Russians couldn't understand. I mean, even when we were allies with them in the Second World War, we weren't spying on them, and they thought that was a bit weird. So until Penkovsky in 1962, we had no one who penetrated anything. I think Penkovsky certainly changed things during the Cuban Missile Crisis because, of course, I think everyone realised the stakes were so high. I mean, whether that happened in the Korean War, I don't think we were ever going to go to war in the Korean War anyway. So I'm not sure that they did really change. I mean, they claim that, and other people have made that case, but I'm not sure that they were that effective, really. I don't think they saved the world.
One more question.
With all this philandering, how many of them came down with STDs?
I noticed that the doctors that they all had were specialists in STD. Burgess and Blunt shared the same doctor. But then passed them on to Burgess. They were lovers, yeah. Maclean and Burgess were lovers.
No,
Blunt and Burgess. They were gay, the doctors as well, yeah. But Burgess's mother also had one of these doctors, so I don't know what that says. But it's certainly true that Burgess was caught in a public lavatory who said he'd met his Waterloo at Paddington. And he had to flee to, in fact, he fled to the Ritz in Paris for 3 months. To escape British authorities. So they were always, and if you look on his BBC record, he was always taking 4 or 5 days off here and there, and I think there's a pretty good indication that a lot of that was to treat various sexual diseases. So yeah, he liked everything. They all liked rough trade, and they liked to discuss politics with lorry drivers. So it was all slightly weird. But Jack Hewitt, who was Burgess' boyfriend, the picture we saw there, one of his boyfriends, said that he would sleep with anyone and could seduce anyone, which doesn't surprise me, actually.
And did they use it as blackmail a lot of the time? Burgess was using it as homosexuality.
Well, I think certainly he befriended a lot of people through it and got to know them. He when his flat was when he left, they found lots of love letters in a guitar case in his flat, and the immediate first thought was this was rather sentimental, and then they realised he'd been keeping them to blackmail the people, and he used to lend out his flat for assignations to friends who were bisexual but married, and then actually put the screws in them. And one of the reasons they say that Peter Thornycroft, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, allowed him to have money sent to him in Moscow was because Burgess basically had something on Peter Thornycroft.
Thank you very much, Andrew.